One thing I did not announce, so I will make mention, we will meet Tuesday night next week. We always meet on Tuesday night of Thanksgiving week. We will not have our Bible reading. We have our annual reading with the Church at Hamilton in August. We put it off until supposedly next week, but they're still not even meeting on Wednesdays. And so I talked to Ted I talked to Ted and Ryan, then I talked to Steve, and we decided, well, we'll just put it off until we can, until we think we can get it done. And so we'll just have regular classes next week, just like normal. This class will meet, teen class will meet, kids will meet. And so, but that'll be next Tuesday. I'll try to remember to send everybody a remind text for that. But we've just always met on Tuesday night of Thanksgiving week to give folks a chance to travel and whatever that they may need to do. All right, looking at page 26, the first full paragraph begins with the fourth reason. Speaking about the reason it is difficult to choose good over evil is because it is easier to shift blame when we do wrong than to accept responsibility for the sin that is in our lives. I was teaching a class, one of the video classes for PTP. I believe it was the age 10 to 12. And in a discussion of the fact that things really haven't changed from the beginning of time. We think that look, we know that we know a lot more things than people did 2,000 or 4,000 or 6,000 years ago, so far as technology and a little bit about how the world works and things of that nature. But so far as getting through life from day to day and dealing with people from day to day and dealing with ourselves from day to day, man hasn't changed. I mean, we just start reading, we start reading in our Bibles, and we don't have to read very far before we find some folks that didn't want to take responsibility for their actions. In fact, you just look at the first two people that were ever made, and there's your case study. The Bible says that Satan tempted Eve. There's nothing in the text that says he tempted Adam. Not one thing. Not in the Old Testament and not in the New. There's also nothing in the Old or New Testament that said that Adam was deceived. Rather, the Bible is clear that Eve was deceived and fell into transgression, 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 11 and following. But when this thing came about in the Garden of Eden, and Eve was deceived, and then it says she gave to her husband and he ate. Of course, then the Bible says their eyes were opened, everything changed. And when God happened upon the scene, he asked Adam, he said, have you eaten of the tree that I told you not to eat? And he said, he blamed God. He said, the woman you gave me that, and I ate it. So then he looked at the woman and he said, what have you done? What have you done? And she said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. So Adam blamed God and blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent, and then the serpent didn't have anybody to blame. He was the only one who didn't have somebody to blame. But that just shows that people do not want to accept responsibility for their actions. Then there's also the account of that's listed here of Aaron and the children of Israel. When Moses was delayed from coming down from the mountain, the people said, this man Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. And it wasn't like he'd been gone a year. It wasn't like and it wasn't like they didn't know where he had went. I mean, they knew where he went, they knew why he went, and yet, being fickle, they had Aaron to craft this golden calf. Well, the people began to rise up and play before it, and a bunch of them got killed over it. And because of the tribe of Levi, they girded up their swords and exacted vengeance on literally thousands of people died in that particular incident. And then Moses comes down and he confronts Aaron, and Aaron's basically said, well, you know how the people are. They gave me all this gold, and I just threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. Aaron didn't accept any responsibility, at all. And then let's just walk on down the corridors of history. When Saul comes back after his defeat of the Amalekites, wherein he'd been instructed expressly, you kill everybody and you kill every animal. Nobody gets out of this alive. And no animal gets out of this alive. And so here comes Saul back, and the first words out of his mouth, incidentally, are so ironic because he sees Samuel, and his first announcement is, I have obeyed the commandment of the Lord. And Samuel said, oh, really? Really? Then what is this bleating of sheep and this lowing of oxen that I hear? In other words, why do I hear all these animals? Oh, well, the people saved out the animals so that we could sacrifice to the Lord. Now, question, who is in charge of that campaign? Who was in charge? Well, Saul was in charge. So whose fault was it that the people brought back animals? It was his fault. What he needed was Harry Truman's desk sign. Famously, Harry Truman had a sign on his desk in the Oval Office that said, the buck stops here. Well, that's where it stopped in Israel. It stopped with Saul. But he blamed the people. Moreover, he didn't kill everybody. He brought back Agag, the king. And so we see, over and over and over again, people have not been willing to accept the consequences of their actions. And so you look at the bottom of page 26, the top of page 27. He mentions David. David committed some really grievous sins. Listen, his sin with Bathsheba was basically just the tip of the iceberg, because he murdered her husband, and there ain't no other way to look at it. I mean, that's right. He sent him out to the head of the hottest part of the battle and commanded Joab to withdraw the troops from him for the express purpose of killing them. And by the way, the man he had killed carried his own death warrant in his hand when he left David's house and went back to the battle. He carried his own death warrant in his hands, sent that word back in that man's own hand, and murdered him. And then after he was killed, David took Bathsheba in his house to be his wife, and the Bible says the thing displeased the Lord. But when Nathan was sent to deal with the matter, David, in contrast to all the people that we've already talked about, said, I have sinned. I have sinned. And then he penned a great psalm of lamentation over that sin, which we know is the 51st Psalm. In the 4th verse, he said, against you and you alone have I sinned and committed this great wickedness or evil in your sight. And David pleads with the Lord for forgiveness, but he said, I acknowledge my sins. And he didn't blame Bathsheba, and he didn't blame Uriah, and he didn't blame Joab. He accepted the responsibility for his actions. And so, David in this particular case was an exception with regard to accepting his personal responsibility for his actions. All right. Now, over on page 27, in the second paragraph, it says, the reason personal accountability is so important is because we can never make significant changes to our character and personality until we admit that we are personally responsible for the mess that we've made of our lives. As long as a person seeks to blame somebody else for the sorry mess that is their life, they will never, ever change. Because they don't see the need to change. Because it's somebody else's fault that I'm like this. It's mom and daddy's fault that I'm like this. It's my ex-wife's fault that I'm like this. It's my boss's fault that I'm like, the list just goes on and on and on. It's the police's fault. It's just one thing right after another. And so as long as there's somebody to blame, to take the blame off of me and put it on somebody else, then why should I change? Why should I change? It's not my fault. I'm not the one that needs to change. Somebody else needs to change. And so, and that's one of the, by the way, that's one of the keys in many of the various self-help or 12-step or however many step programs, is that people have to admit, I'm an alcoholic because of the choices that I made. I'm a drug addict because of the choices that I made. I'm here today because of the choices that I've made. And now I found myself in a bind that I can't get out of, and I need help. And I'm here to learn how to change. I'm here to learn how to change. I knew a young lady when I was in high school, and that ended up in a 30-day in-house drug rehabilitation program. She's 17 years old, and she spends 30 days in a hospital because she's a drug addict. And none of us knew that she was a drug addict. We just didn't know. And so she comes out, and she's told, obviously by the people in the place where she's been, and by all of us who are concerned about her, you're going to have to find different people to hang out with. You can't go back and run around with the same people that you were running with that got you in this mess. But she didn't listen to us. She went right back out, running with the same crowd, and it wasn't 2 or 3 months later, guess where she was again? Right back in that same hospital, addicted to drugs. She didn't want to change. She didn't accept responsibility for the mess that her life was in at that time. And so a person has to accept responsibility in order to make changes and have the desire to make changes. The fourth line says, when I take ownership of bad decisions, stop shifting blame, stop denying the truth, then I can begin the difficult process of improving my character by making different and better decisions. By the way, anybody here listen to Dave Ramsey besides me? I haven't listened to him in a while, but anybody ever listen to Dave Ramsey, Tony? Well, Dave Ramsey's going to tell you, people are going to call Dave Ramsey and say, I make $30,000 a year and I've got $150,000 of credit card debt. And the first thing he's going to do is he's going to club you with a baseball bat. Just like training a mule. You can train a mule, but first you got to get his attention. He's going to give you a big, heavy dose of truth. And then he's going to tell you, you're going to have to change. You're going to have to change. And here's what you're going to have to do. And he gives them steps. And by the way, if people will do what Dave says to do, their lives will get better. And every time the program is on, there's somebody that'll say, I make $40,000 a year, and I had $100,000 of debt, and 5 years later, I'm debt-free. Well, how'd you do that? Well, I did what you told me. I ate beans and rice for about 5 years. I quit going out to eat all the time. I quit going here, there. I quit buying, Cokes and candy bars. I did what you said. And I got out of debt. And so, but it required an entire lifestyle change.
He tells people not to buy a car.
Yeah, that's right. Don't borrow money to buy a car.
Save it up.
That's right. If you can't pay cash for it, don't buy it. And so, by the way, he built about a $40 million house, and he didn't borrow no money either. So, but you know, if people will follow that plan, they'll make it. But they have to change. They have to accept responsibility for the mess, the financial mess that they've made out of their lives. And then lastly, on the next paragraph, the final challenge to choosing good over evil is the fact that we live in a generation that is so ungodly. And we talked a little bit about this last week. Actually, we talked about it at some length. You know, used to, people tried to hide their sin. You know, people that, well, for example, people, the idea of what's a brown bag for? What's a brown bag for, Kathy? Carry your liquor in. Carry your liquor around. Right? You got a brown bag. Why? Because what? Don't want nobody to see it. By the way, Playboy magazine used to be mailed in a brown wrapper where you couldn't see it. So people could have Playboy delivered to their house, and nobody, the mail person or whoever, wouldn't know what it was. Well, now what do we got? People don't care. They don't care. You know, now it was a little bit different where I grew up and where Rhonda grew up because of we grew up outside the Bible Belt. And there's a lot more heavily Catholic influence and worldly influence, and people where we grew up drank a lot more as a general rule than people here. But you can say what you want, but when counties are dry, fewer people will drink, and when they go wet, more people will drink. When you make something easier to get a hold of, more people will participate. Well, I never even knew what dry county was till I came, actually when I went to college at Murray, Callaway County was a dry county, a college town, a dry county of all things. But, so we were accustomed to seeing people, as Ron White would say, drunk in public. All right, but, you didn't see a whole lot of that around here, and now you see it all the time. Why? Well, people just don't care. They don't care. Because the world has become so ungodly that those types of things aren't frowned upon anymore. The way people dress. And I don't mean just the fact, I'm not talking about the knucklehead that wears pajamas and fuzzy slippers to Walmart. That's not the ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people that hardly even got enough clothes on to take a shower, that are parading around out in public. No shame. No shame. And
when you go Walmart, first selling beer, well, we got right now.
now you don't even think nothing about it. It still bothers me to see people toting beer around at Walmart. It just does.
I've never had a bit down that aisle that's got all the
Well, if you drink Gatorade, you got to go down that aisle.
Yeah, but I don't drink Gatorade.
But I do. But and then think about this. You want to talk about the ungodliness. What about all these, well, lack of a better term, pervert parades? With them parading down the streets, and men barely dressed like women, and women dressed like men, and just flaunting every type of sexual perversion right down the middle of Broadway. Their pride parade. Ain't nothing to be proud of. But that's the world we live in. But people used to keep those things aside because they weren't fit for public consumption. And now, oh man, look at the lunacy that marks our society today, where men think they can be women and women think they can be men. I'm just waiting for somebody to be a dog. Your taxes would be a lot less if you was a dog. They don't tax dogs. One of these days I might identify as a dog if my taxes get too bad. All I want to do, I'll just pay my leash fee, get my rabies shot, and move on.
What gets me is what you were talking about a while ago, the credit card debt. They say there's between 16 and 18,000 average per person.
I know.
In the United States.
I know.
All right, you get to think about it. I don't know that.
No, and I don't either.
Well, now.
Somebody's got
the
yours
average-
and somebody's
the
got
average
mine.
is going up.
I know, but again, people they're not willing to live the kind of life that's demanded of, well, for example, of their income.
Yeah.
Their income. All right. Looking at page 27. Says, there have been times in more recent history that sin was most commonly practiced in the dark shadows of community life because people had the good sense to be ashamed of their evil behavior. I love that line. They had the good sense to be ashamed of their evil behavior. You know, when I was a teenager and a young adult, I didn't live right. But when I was not doing right, I was not going to do right under the cloak of darkness. You know, nobody was going to, well, number one, because, well, number one, I didn't want my mother to know. Number two, I didn't want my grandparents to know. You know, number three, I didn't want the 400 people at church that I went to every Sunday to know. You know, in other words, I had enough sense to, by the way, I wasn't probably fooling anybody, but at least I tried. You know, I'm not excusing the way I lived, but because it was wrong. But you know, I didn't live that way just, you know, out in front of the world like that. And you know, and today it's, you know, sin is practiced out in the open without shame, without apology. You know, twice in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet said, "Were my people ashamed? Were they ashamed?" And it says, "No, they were not ashamed, neither could they blush." Now, what does it mean to blush?
It embarrasses you for
To
something.
be embarrassed, that's right. People in Jeremiah's day didn't have enough decency to even blush. By the way, that's 600 years before Jesus. All right? 600 years before Jesus. And the prophet says the people of God don't have enough sense to be ashamed of the way they're living. That's Jeremiah 6 and Jeremiah 8. Jeremiah 8:12, I believe, is the specific passage there. You know, so you know, we live in a world that lacks the ability to blush. I mean, let me ask you a question. Is there anything that you would see in public or on television that would surprise you now?
No.
No. Not one thing. You know what would surprise me to see on television? Something that's worth watching. You know, some show that didn't have a bunch of profanity and nudity and exalting all kind of sin in it. Yeah, that'd be the surpriser. That'd be the surpriser. And so, but you know, we do, but there's still nothing here to surprise you. I mean, I believe you, Furman. Look, I'm still living here right now because I believe I live in the best place in the world. I've lived in Missouri, 2 places in Tennessee, not counting when I went to school. I've lived in Arizona. I've lived in 2 places in Missouri. Hands down, ain't nothing as good as where I live right now, so far as the people and everything else. That's why I'm still here 25 years later and got no plans to leave. But that still doesn't mean that there's nothing that would surprise me, because it's just the world. It's just the world that we live in now. And then I love the statement down at the bottom, page 27. By the way, it's 7 o'clock. These kids are fixed to start rolling in here, which means I'm going to have to pick up on choosing excellence and then move on to chapter 3. But I love the thing, and it never struck me like this. Noah was perfect in his generation. Perfect in his generation. And the emphasis there is, what was his generation? What was, the Who sang the song, talking about my generation. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're talking about the people that live alongside me, that are my age, that are whatever. Blameless in his generation. Well, what kind of generation did Noah live in? The thought and intent of every man's heart was to only do evil continually. The world was filled with violence. And so the greatness of Noah is seen in the life that he lived within the context of the world in which he lived. Let me give you a quick example. I loved to go to church camp when I was a teenager. I'd go 2 or 3 weeks out of the year. We had camp about 10 minutes from home. And I'm going to tell you something. If I could live at church camp 52 weeks a year, I'd have been one of the best teenagers you ever saw. But my problem was I could only live at camp 3 weeks out of the year, and I had to live in the rest of the world the other 49 weeks out of the year. What's your point, Todd? My point is, it's easy to live right when you're surrounded by people who want to live right. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, think about whatever vice that you may have ever had in your entire life, whether it be alcohol or some form of drugs or pornography or look, whatever it might be, all right? Whatever it might be. You're not tempted to do those things in here. Why? Because you're surrounded with people that don't approve of those things, and you don't want to participate in those things because of the positive peer pressure. Right? It's easy to live right when you live in, we'll just call this the bubble. But when you got to get outside the bubble is when it gets difficult. That's the greatness of Noah. Who did Noah have to count on to help him live right? Who did he have? Did he have some circle of friends that influenced? No. The whole world was overtaken in wickedness. And Noah still did right. That's the greatness of Noah. Not that his life was exceptional compared to other people through the course of history, but that his life was exceptional given the conditions in which he had to live. That's the greatness of Noah. All right, next week, next week, page 28, and then lesson 3. Yeah. No, there's fewer preachers, but the downside is also there are fewer congregations that can pay a guy to preach full time. We really need more and more what we call tent-making preachers, what they call vocational preachers, preachers that say teach school for their primary source of income and insurance, and then preach somewhere. That's the need. Now it's a shame that it's that way. It's a shame that it's that way, but you think about, well, just look in our county. How many congregations now don't have full-time preachers that had them 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago? And so, but I mean, our schools are still turning out. Our schools of preaching are still turning out preachers, but and there's still plenty of places for them. What I'm saying is there's a lot of places that can't find anybody to preach because they can't afford to hire somebody to preach. Pay somebody full-time support to preach. And so, but I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Big cities that do that around places like this, country, they're going to make a lot of money.
Yeah. All right. The kids are out. It's 5 after. I ran over time.